Hey guys, what is up? It is Kristen, and today I have a video for you on structs and the difference between structs and classes, both of which create objects. Objects being new ways of storing information, right? We can create an object and then assign it a bunch of variables which will be contained within that object. So here you can see that I'm using a struct and I'm calling its student to decide like what is the information that I'm parsing. Well, I'm parsing some information from a text file with some names and some scores from a test. So these are all students, and we're going to assign the information from the line into an object called student of student type. And likewise, you can see here that I have a name variable, I have a score variable, and I have a passed Boolean variable. And we only have data on the line from the text file for the name and the score, so we're going to have to check for the information once we store it to see whether that student passed or failed the exam. So I'm going to start with my main and talk about what I'm doing. I am going to declare an array of student objects. So similar to having like an int array, we now have a student array which is associated with the struct that we've created. So this is going to contain a bunch of objects which are student type objects. And it's called class roster, and it's going to have a size of 20 based on the information that's coming in from the text file. I have an index called numStudents, which is keeping track of the number of students that I read in, and that is going to be increased with the line. So this is actually the line number as we go through the file, adding one student at a time. And here what I'm doing is I'm creating a blank student object called person. And person is not going to have any attributes yet. So we can use this similarly to like a temp variable when we're like a string temp when we're parsing, stuff from a line. We're going to reuse person. So every time that we assign attributes from the line, we have a singular person, a singular object, and we want to contain multiple persons. So every time we're going to use person to grab the information and store it into an object, and then we're going to pass that person into a class roster which will be populated by several persons, by 20 people. So you can think of there's a bunch of student persons within the student class roster, both of which are the same data type coming from the struct that we have defined above. So each one of those locations will contain these attributes or these variables within each ith location. So once I have that information, I can start doing file I/O just like I've done before, where we're going to open a file stream, open a file with that file stream. Then we're going to check to see if the file stream opened correctly, and if so, we're going to parse the information. I've declared some stuff here to pass to a split function. And you can see that it's similar to what I have used before in some of my previous examples, and it's something similar to what you've seen in your previous homeworks. So this uses substrings to parse the information on the line. And after we call that split function in our while loop, we can then assign the information from the temporary array to that temporary object called person. So you can see here that person is storing the value at a of 0, which should be the name coming from that particular line. And we're using .name to access the variable name within the object person. So name is inside of person, and name is here inside of a student object. Similarly, this is one student object called person, and it has a name inside of it. So we assign name directly because it is a string, and then we assign score similarly, but we have to convert it because we are storing the scores inside of person as an integer. So we do an STOI on the value here at a of 1, which should contain the score at the second position in a of 0, or within the temporary array of a. The last thing here is we're checking for the value stored within score. So we assigned it here, and then we're going to check for it once we've assigned it to see if it is larger than 70. for that particular person. So for instance, on the first line, we gather Abigail. The name Abigail is stored in person.name, and then we store 77 into Abigail's score inside of the person object. And then we check to see if the score, which is 77, stored within person, is larger than 70, and it is. So we're going to give Abigail a passing score Boolean variable of true. And likewise, if we see any other students in the file with scores less than 70, they're going to have a passing Boolean variable of false assigned to them. And after we go through all of this, we should have a completely filled object. So that object has a name, it has a score, and it has a pass Boolean variable that have attributes within it now at that point. So we're going to store person into an array class roster at some index, which is going to be the index of the line that we're currently looking at. And that's also going to be the number of students that we've got from the file. So num students will increase right after we add person one time. So we keep repeating this every line. So we store Abigail and her score, and then we store Michael, and then Rhonda, and then Eduardo, until we reach the end of the file. After we reach the end of the file, we're going to call a function to pass the array and the size of that array of objects and print out the information inside of it. I could have called this print roster, but I decided to call it menu. And you can see here that when I call menu, I'm passing that information here, and that the parameters for menu are set up similarly to what you've seen before. So instead of like an integer array, the type for this class roster is student because it's associated with the struct student. And now we also are passing it as arrays. So you can see that I'm using brackets to denote that class roster is an array of student objects, and it has some size, which I'm also passing as well in order to index across it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to print all of the information stored in class roster just to make sure that we got all of the information from the text file correctly. Then I'm going to break it up into two subsets of information where I'm going to print the passing scores here and the failing scores here based on that Boolean variable stored within the struct. So here we've got passing assigned a true or false value related to the score. So if the score is larger than 70, passed is true. Otherwise, it is false. And you can see here that what I'm doing is I'm going through class roster using a for loop until we reach the size, the number of students, and at every ith location within class roster, there is some student object. There's some person there. And in order to print the information stored within it, we need to print the attributes of the object rather than the object itself. So we say that whoever in the array of people or students, whoever is at that ith location, we're going to print the name inside of that object. And likewise, we're going to do the same thing with the score. So the score is stored within the object, the student object, inside of the class roster at some I index location. And we also check here to see if it's true or false with a passing value. If it is, we print the passing scores. If it is not, we print the failing scores. And lastly, what I want to talk about is how do you actually pass an object back from a function? Well, you can actually set up structs to be passed back as return values. So you could set up a function with a struct object return type. So this is saying, like, similarly to like an int function, right? An int function expects to return an integer. A string function returns a string. What we're doing here is we're returning a student object from new student back to wherever we call this. So the first thing I do here is I create a new object. This is just like a blank object, just like person in the main. And we're going to assign some information to this new object. And all we're going to do is ask for a name and then give them a default score because they probably didn't actually take the test, and they probably need to just have a base value of false because they never actually took the test, but maybe they came into the class late for some reason. And lastly, once we have that information stored within new person, we're going to return that as a return variable. So after menu is called, I call new student, and person has been reused throughout the while loop to grab and store the information into the class roster. And we're going to reuse person again to store whatever we have returned in an object from new student. So that information in new person in the last function will be assigned to the person object here because it is the catch or the return from new student. And you can see here that what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if we can print the name associated with the person that we got from the function. Okay, so let me go ahead and run this code and let's see what we get with our output. And of course, because I'm compiling here, I want to make sure that you see that I'm compiling with G++ space minus std equals to lowercase c ++ 11 space the .cpp name that I am compiling. And we have no error message, so we're going to print our executable file and see what our output looks like. Well, we can see here that when we print the entire roster, we're getting all of the information from the text file correctly. And when we check the subsets of the information, we can see here that we are getting all of the passing scores and the names associated with the passing scores that are larger than 70. And here we're also doing the same thing for the students that did not pass. And of course, you can see here that we are actually getting prompted for a student name, which means that we are correctly inside of our new student function. So we're going to see if we can return a name that is not stored within our txt file or the array of that information that we have parsed up to this point. So I'm going to give it a different name, and we're going to print that after. And we can see that we printed that name. That name was not associated with the information from the text file, which means that we returned it from the function and it got assigned to the person object, which we then used .name on person to grab the name stored within and print it. Okay, well that's all I've got for you on structs. I hope this video is informative and it helps you to understand the difference between implementing a struct and implementing a class in order to create objects from data. Thanks guys, and I'll see you later.